If you've got any questions during his talk, I will be monitoring the chat, so please raise your hand and we can call on you. If you've got a microphone, go ahead and speak your question. If not, just type it in the chat and I will read it. And with that, I would like to thank Dr. Holt for speaking with us. Dr. Holt, his love of animals began at an early age. Okay, sorry. Love of animals began at an early age, and he has been an avid horse rider since he was 9 years old. Dr. Holt completed his undergrad in 1986 from the Gettysburg College and then attended the University of Pennsylvania School of Veterinary Medicine, graduating in 1991. In 1993, Dr. Holt decided to open his own,
veterinary practice.
Thank you. My phone just turned off. Called Brandywine Veterinary Services, which he still runs today. He has served on the board and executive committee of the PMVA. The PMVA awarded Dr. Holt with the Animal Welfare Advocacy Award in 2015. Dr. Holt is currently serving on an animal welfare committee with the Animal Welfare and Public Policy Committee and is the chairman on the One Health Task Force, as well as the commissioner for the Animal Health and Diagnostic Commission. In addition to those, Dr. Holt is also on the board for the Parksburg Point in Parksburg, Pennsylvania. Currently, he works 3 days per week as a veterinarian for New Holland Sales Stables in New Holland, Pennsylvania, working predominantly with cows and horses. Dr. Holt, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight, and we look forward to your talk.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. I didn't realize you were going to read my entire bio, but thank you. So I'll start by just mentioning, I figure you guys already have familiarity with the term One Health, but essentially what it is the health of people, the health of animals, and the health of the environment. And as a phrase, you can just say we all occupy the third rock. So as I mentioned, or was mentioned in my bio, I am a commissioner for the Animal Health and Diagnostic Commission, and it's how I got involved in the One Health project. So the Animal Health and Diagnostic Commission is an entity at the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. It is primarily involved in dealing with animal health issues, but they sort of reorganized about 2016, I believe it was, and One Health was one of the topics that got added to that repertoire of animal health issues. We've always had representation from the Department of Health on the Animal Health Commission, but our focus is primarily animal health. And as was mentioned in my bio, I am the veterinarian for New Holland Sales Stables, and Jen and I were talking a little bit before the meeting started, but I'll just reiterate what I mentioned there. And New Holland Sales Stables, for those that aren't familiar, is the largest livestock auction east of the Mississippi River. It's located in New Holland, Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania, Lancaster County. And to give you some idea of the volume of animals that come through there, they average over 8,000 animals passing through their doors every week. My job there is dealing with animal welfare issues for horses, cattle, pigs, calves, sheep and goats, and all those animals are represented at the sale. There's no small animals or any exotics sold at that sale. So this is just a picture here of one of the horse sales at New Holland. A lot of riding horses are sold on Monday. Actually, the horses are one of the smaller sales at the barn. So back to the subject at hand, One Health. So the Animal Health and Commission, or Animal Health and Diagnostic Commission, reformed in 2012 or 2016. It's been in existence since, I believe, 1989 was when it was first formed, and it was really formed to help. Well, we're involved in getting money to Penn State and to the veterinary school at University of Pennsylvania, other institutions, but also to help support the veterinary laboratory system as well. And when the One Health liaison formed in 2016, I basically became chairman because I was the only person sitting around the table that had ever heard of the term One Health. So that kind of solidified it. I've been the chairman of that task force ever since, and it started out as being kind of lonely. I basically reached out to other individuals that were already sitting around the table, people like the USDA, Veterinary Services. They have a One Health program on the federal side, USDA Wildlife Services, and some of the other people that were around the table already, or at least involved with the Animal Health Commission. And initially, I was basically trying to surround myself with professionals that were experts in the environmental field, in animal health, and also human health. Interestingly enough, it was relatively easy to convince veterinarians to become involved with this because essentially we're already geared toward One Health in many respects. I regularly see 7 species. They're all domesticated species, but it's common. I mean, as a large animal veterinarian, I drive around to farms, so I get to see the animals in their environment. When you're dealing with animal health issues, you're naturally looking at what environmental situation helped create that situation. For example, poor ventilation in a barn leading to respiratory disease in calves. Very common thing in my part of the country because a lot of the barns that were built either in the 17, 18, or early 1900s, and ventilation was not well understood at that point in time. So it kind of became natural to for veterinarians to be familiar with it. The hardest group that I've found to get involved with One Health have been the human health professionals. And I'm not exactly sure why that is. Back in 2016, I actually was also president of the PVMA, or Pennsylvania Veterinary Medical Association, and we took it upon ourselves to present a One Health symposium, and we decided that the best way to get the human health side involved in this was to actually have it at the medical school at Penn. And interestingly enough, there were about 200 participants, and about 20% of those were human health providers, and about 80% of them were veterinarians. So it was still a challenge, even though we took it right to their door. So even today, I have to say I still struggle to get human health providers involved in One Health, but things are getting better. So after a couple of months of getting the right people around the table, we developed a mission and vision statements, and I'm not going to read it, but basically bringing professionals and the other stakeholders together to share knowledge, find common ground, and refine policy to essentially help move forward the idea that when we have an outbreak of a particular disease, such as coronavirus, that it often involves other aspects that maybe the human health providers or human health industry is not that familiar with. The coronavirus, for example, is thought to have come from bats and was probably propagated in a wet market in China that sells bats. Those things are typically under the jurisdiction of the Department of Agriculture. So having the ability of professionals from different walks of life to deal with the problem rather than having people that are not necessarily familiar with a particular situation, the outcome typically is better. So getting a little far afield here, but in the process of developing the mission statement, we also developed a vision statement, and it says much the same thing as our mission statement, but it's a little less wordy. Our vision was for healthier people, animals, and plants, and ecosystems thriving in an increasingly vibrant Pennsylvania. So we started developing some goals, and I won't belabor how these things formed, but what I thought in the beginning was we should try and tackle something that is clearly a One Health type of issue, but it's relatively easy to solve. So after quite a bit of discussion, we ended up deciding that rabies was going to be the topic that we were going to tackle first. I've already gotten off topic here, so I'll get back to this slide. So as I mentioned, we are developing some core members, and then we would also add experts or stakeholders on certain subjects that we're developing and bring them into the discussion. And it might be for a short time, or if they were interested in staying, they were certainly welcome to stay and participate in our meetings. We currently meet about once a month, although I actually just canceled our April meeting because about 2/3 of our participants are currently so involved in the coronavirus that there's really almost no hours in the day to do anything else. So I figured we would postpone our April meeting and just regroup again in May. I'll just go through the list of current participants. As I mentioned, USDA Wildlife and Vet Services, Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, Pennsylvania Department of Health, Department of Conservation and Natural Resources, DEP, PEMA, Department of Transportation, the Fish and Boat Commission, the Game Commission, and then we have a long list, and that's not even all inclusive, of all the universities that are currently involved in the discussions that we have. So getting back to rabies, so we picked rabies because there's a lot known about rabies. We know what causes it. We know how to prevent it. There's a vaccine for it. What our biggest project biggest problem that we identified was that if, say, Joe Public has a raccoon in their backyard that they're suspicious of rabies, and they contact the Game Commission about that particular situation, the Game Commission would answer the questions pertaining to the wildlife. But when it came to health issues, say there was a human exposure or a dog was exposed or something like that, they would turf it to Department of Agriculture or Department of Health. Well, and rightly so, because the Game Commission is not really, that's not their purview to give you advice about human exposure. But essentially what ended up happening was you would get a multitude of different answers, or you would have to contact a multitude of different people to have all your questions answered. And what we wanted to do was bring all the messaging together into one place. So we wanted the Game Commission, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Health all to work together to develop a website that both health professionals and Game Commission professionals and ag professionals would all be able to turn to or point to say, here is a list of answers to your questions, or who to contact to help solve this problem. We've been moderately successful. I don't want to say we're completely successful, because we do actually have an active website that is under the governor's website at pa.gov. However, if you were to Google search rabies in PA or something along those lines, you would find that most of the time you're going to get sent to Montgomery County Department of Health, or Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, or even the Game Commission. And so we're still struggling with getting getting our first project to completely work. But one thing that we recognized in pursuing the rabies topic was that everybody around the table thought that this was a fantastic idea, and that this would solve a lot of problems. Our problem was that when it came time to actually implement this, we had difficulty getting the higher ups to buy in. So most of our participants were very enthusiastic, but they were not the decision makers at the table in the Department of Health that would actually implement coexist or creating a document that would correspond with Department of Agriculture's people, who would create a website, so on and so forth. So it gave us some insight into how difficult getting people in different silos to work together. So as a result of running up against problems in our very first project, being rabies, we decided that really what we needed to do was create an executive order, which it's a fairly wordy document at this point. It's about 5 pages, but the gist of it is that the governor is mandating 8 different agencies to provide representatives to an advisory committee that started as the One Health Task Force, but it answers directly to the governor's office. And so those different agencies were the same ones that I listed before in the slide, and that's Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health, DCNR, DEP, FEMA, PennDOT, Fish and Boat, Game Commission. And then we would, so those 8 agencies would have representation, and then we provided 18 slots for other individuals or other organizations, such as the USDA Wildlife and Vet Service, different universities that wanted to participate, but also having the ability to bring other experts in on certain subjects. I'd love to say that we have an executive order at this point, but we're still not quite there. We thought that it would happen this year, but given our current situation, I think it's pretty unlikely that 2020 will be the year that the One Health Advisory Committee is formed. I still think that it's going to happen, but I can't say when. So we've been pushing forward with the executive order. In particular, we've been thinking about what's the best way to have that advisory committee operate. And in many respects, we've kind of come to a conclusion that operating on a emergency basis, like PEMA, where there's a particular project, and we would bring all the individuals together that would participate in that, and it would allow groups to form that would divvy up the responsibilities in the different areas and essentially make things happen in a One Health kind of way. I also put on this slide the Goddard Conference. One of the other things that we have attempted to do in the One Health Task Force is to create some education. So one of our participants was the Goddard chair from Penn State, and I probably won't I'll butcher his title. He recently retired, Cal DeBrock, and he was in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources, I believe. So the Goddard Conference took place. It was conducted in conjunction with the annual meeting of the Pennsylvania Veterinary Medical Association. So there were already veterinarians in place for the site, and it made expenses doable. It was conducted in Hershey in 2018, August of 2018, and we felt that it was relatively close to Harrisburg, so we might get some representation from government individuals, and there were several there, and also some participation from the human health side, since the Hershey Medical Center was right across the street from where it was conducted at Hershey Lodge. There were about 175 participants at that meeting. It was a one-day conference. Initially, we had 3 speakers. All 3 were discussing One Health, but from different perspectives. So we had a person who was discussing One Health from an animal health perspective, someone else from a human health perspective, and a third person from an environmental health perspective. That was the first half of the day, and then the second half of the day, we broke out into groups of about 10 and discussed different topics that and methods for furthering One Health. So we broke out into groups discussing vector-borne diseases, antibiotic resistance, Lyme disease. There was quite a few topics that were brought up, and that was a really excellent process. It basically quadrupled the network of individuals that participated in the One Health task force meetings, and has really been a useful process. Unfortunately, we at our One Health task force have a budget of 0, and so we are dependent on the good graces of other individuals, such as Cal DeBrock, to bring some funds to creating these kind of events. But I would love to do that again. So, as I mentioned, some of the other things that that were brought up at that meeting were the Chesapeake Bay, food safety, Lyme disease. So we were able to kind of focus our attention in a number of different areas from there. So some of the topics that we've discussed, or we've broken out into subcommittees since then, involve lead contamination. That actually started as a discussion of using lead ammunition and how some of the predator birds were becoming, they were dying basically of lead toxicity. And instead of looking at this as in a focus of just lead ammunition, we opened it up into basically lead contamination, and that is being moved forward with by the Department of Health. So that we have a subcommittee that's working on lead contamination currently. Another project that we're working on, there we go, is free-roaming cats. This is a topic that has a lot of emotion. There's certainly a lot of people out there that are concerned about free-roaming cats because of the destruction that they create in wildlife. Songbird populations have diminished greatly, and one of the major causes of that are free-roaming cats. And then there's also, on the other side of it, a lot of people that feed cats and maintain feral colonies. So we launched into that subject about 6 months ago, and have a subcommittee that's working on that as well. Most recently, prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, we were asked as a group to comment on a plan that was put together by the Game Commission to help deal with chronic wasting disease. So chronic wasting disease is found in deer and elk in the state of Pennsylvania. And it is a One Health issue because deer are not only wildlife species, but they're also farmed in Pennsylvania. So there's a number of deer, what we refer to it basically as deer inside the fence and deer outside the fence. We have CWD in animals both inside and outside the fence. And they're being handled by two different groups. The ones outside the fence are the primary responsibility of the Game Commission. The ones inside the fence are primarily the responsibility of the Department of Agriculture. And the Game Commission recently created a plan to help reduce CWD in deer outside the fence. The Department of Agriculture has been working on CWD on deer within the fence for a number of years. And we wanted to try and make sure the plans worked well together. So we created a document for the Secretary of Agriculture to help him make comments to the Game Commission to help those plans work better together. So the elephant in the room is the last topic on that slide, COVID-19. We just had one meeting last month, the end of February, about COVID-19. We had a presentation by Dr. Kuchipudi from Penn State, who's a virologist at the Department of Veterinary Sciences, I believe. And he is a coronavirus expert, and at that point in time gave us a rundown on what was current knowledge on COVID-19 and about coronaviruses in general. And so that has kind of gotten us to where we are at this point. Certainly COVID-19 has created some issues for us. I would say in all likelihood, the One Health Task Force, because we really have not gotten to the point where we can probably participate in the governor's response to COVID-19 in a really meaningful way. And a lot of our participants are currently directly involved in the response, we've kind of hit a roadblock to some degree. I just canceled our meeting for April 10th of our One Health Task Force. Mostly, we could certainly do it online on Zoom like we're doing this meeting, but given the fact that a large number of our participants basically are barely getting enough time to sleep as it is, I didn't want to add anything more to that schedule. So my plan is to pick things up again at the end of May, and hopefully we'll be in a better position to, with some more knowledge on COVID-19, and I'm going to try and bring in some experts in different fields to have a more thorough discussion about that topic. So I didn't see any questions or hear any questions on the way. If you have any questions, feel free to shout.
Okay, if you've got any questions, just raise your hand and or type them in the chat and I can read them off. But thank you very much, Dr. Holt. That was a great presentation.
Well, thank you.
Jen and Dr. Holt, thank you. This is Gene Lingridge. Great presentation. Maybe I'll put you on the spot here a little bit. So what's your take on the role of pets in COVID-19 transmission or such?
Right. So I can only speak from what I have read, mostly in the news, and also what was current knowledge as of the presentation by Dr. Kuchipudi several weeks ago. And there was a report that there was a dog that was positive in North or South Korea. That animal supposedly was not symptomatic, and it was living in a house of a positive human. The thought process, and although it really hasn't been explored, is that the animal was basically was picking up contaminant from the person, and that the virus was not actually active in the animal. There's certainly been some discussion about whether cats are transmitters, but there does not appear to be any evidence. It certainly came from bats, or it appears to have come from bats, based on what Dr. Kuchipudi mentioned at our meeting. And he indicated that although this virus does mutate quite a bit because it's an RNA virus, it doesn't have the ability to correct its DNA when the DNA is created by the human cell. So there's lots of mutations, but it doesn't necessarily cross species lines very often. So we do see coronaviruses in a lot of other species, and in virtually every species that I work on, there's a coronavirus that causes problems. Mostly, I would have to say that they appear to be digestive rather than respiratory in nature, and it certainly could end up crossing species lines, but there doesn't appear to be any evidence so far that it has.
Good, thank you. Yeah, I agree with you on your assessment. That's about what I know as well. Haven't been following it real closely. But I think that is one message that needs to get out there, that these domesticated animals, the dogs and cats that we're around, probably are not playing any role in transmission or actually being infected either. So I know it's been picked up a little bit. Thankfully, it hasn't been very popular in the media, and I hope it stays that way.
Yeah, me too.
I guess the other thing I would just add is that I think pangolins are also playing a role in this development of this currently the SARS-CoV-2. So
Yeah.
I think the bats and the pangolins. I think there's a lot of discussion about which it's come first and where it's circulating and where it got its necessary mutation to to jump to humans. But I think the bats and pangolins both play a role in this chain somehow.
Yeah, and Dr. Kuchipudi mentioned that as well.
Mm-hmm. I do have another question on a different topic, but if other folks wanted to jump in on this one, now would be a good time before I have another question.
I have one that I can read, or you can go first. Your preference.
So it's different than COVID-19?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I guess I'm just wondering, what is your take on swine flu? I guess here in the U.S., one of our great mixing pots are state fairs and ag fairs, where we have lots of animals and people and young people and people eating food near them. So what's your take on the issue around something like swine flu at state and county fairs? I guess there's occasionally some reports. There are infrequent reports of such infections in swine and in humans at fairs. What's your take on that? Have we seen any of that recently in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say I'm necessarily an expert on swine. It is a species that I work on, but it's not my primary species. So, but certainly a number of my clients go to state fairs. I go to fairs. I think they're just as a general event, I think it's a great way for people to become more familiar with agriculture, and so I'm in favor of fairs taking place. As far as disease processes that get transmitted, certainly we think the COVID-19 took place at a wet market in China, or that it jumped from bats and pangolin to people at this wet market. So certainly the exposure of animals and people commingling invites these kind of problems. I would have to say that there are precautions that are being taken, that take place. There's certainly signs around, and there's hand washing stations. There's hand sanitizer stations that are set up, and I think there's a risk, but that I think that the risk is relatively small for the benefits that come out of fairs. So I hope that answers your question. I don't have a lot of specific knowledge about swine flu and how it's transmitted at fairs, so I don't necessarily feel like I should comment too much on that. But in general, I think fairs are of benefit to the human population that far outweigh the risks that of disease transmission. I mean, we've been getting away in the United States from an agrarian society, so our exposure to animals has been decreasing over time. So that does tend to insulate us from zoonotic diseases in some respects, and the vast majority of zoonotic diseases, or the vast majority of new diseases, I should say, in humans, were originally animal diseases. So it's certainly something that we need to keep a watchful eye on. But having lived and worked in the agriculture field for a long period of time, I think that there needs to be an understanding by people of where food comes from. I think it's incredibly important, and it's particularly important in this outbreak. I don't know if you were on the phone in the very beginning before my talk started, but Jen and I were talking a little bit about food security issues, and agriculture is being performed by a smaller and smaller portion of the population. We've really gotten good at producing food here in the United States. But this particular outbreak of disease has created situations that they're putting strains on the system that weren't really anticipated in the past. For example, one of the slaughter plants in the in southeastern Pennsylvania recently had 2 positive individuals, and basically most of the workforce didn't show up the following day to the plant. That plant's responsible for about 28,000 head of cattle being slaughtered a week. And that supplies a large portion of the northeastern United States with beef, with fresh beef. There's going to be a ripple effect. I know it's already created a situation at New Holland sales stables where the price of cattle has dropped significantly because there's nowhere for them to go, and the population of animals that are just waiting at New Holland has about tripled. Another example was a couple of my dairy clients have recently had to dump tankers of milk because, or not tankers, but their milk storage at the farm, because the plant was not able to send out drivers to pick up the milk because a lot of the people that were processing the milk didn't show up to work for fear of the coronavirus. And so the milk, the fluid milk was being disrupted as a result of that. And I personally was in the grocery store on the very same day that I got phone calls from a couple of my clients about having to dump their milk. And there was very little milk on the shelf, and there was not a scrap of yogurt to be found anywhere in the store. So we have issues that have not been anticipated that's creating food security issues. And I would have to say that people are probably not going to shelter it in place very well if they don't have a way of getting food. So that's something that's extremely concerning to me. This is a very roundabout way of answering your question, but I think that having an understanding of agriculture is important, and having an involvement in the general public is of benefit.
Yeah, I agree completely. It is disrupting so many things here. Yeah, so that shortage that we see pictures, the shortage on the grocery store shelves that we see pictures of is not just high demand, but it's also low supply. So
exactly, and
right.
it's so. I emailed the Secretary of Agriculture earlier this week because I was concerned about this situation. And part of the issue, from what I understand, is that a lot of milk was disappearing going into school lunches. The school lunch programs are non-existent for the most part, and milk is a very perishable product. So that's not being included in a lot of these meals that are being put out through other sources to the same students. So the whole fluid milk market is completely in flux right now because the system is not there to provide it to the stores. in the volume that it's disappearing. It's supposed to be going into the schools, but it's not going into the schools. So I'm hoping that they're going to get it resolved relatively quickly, but it's a problem.
Yeah, it is. And so the milk is just the evidence of the agricultural production. There goes, as you know, there are years into producing the animals that are producing that milk that we see on the shelf today. So that disruption is not just rippling immediately, but it'll have a long-term ripple effect as well.
Yeah, because the milk futures market, what they're anticipating the milk price to be in the next coming months has dropped significantly. So our dairy farmers have been on a real diet for the last 4 years because milk prices have been extremely low. And this year was looking relatively stable. This outbreak has created such a dislocation that the futures market has dropped significantly. And so a lot of my dairy farmers who were barely making it to begin with are not probably going to make it too terribly long if the milk price doesn't get supported better.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Jen. That's all for me.
Okay, thanks, Gene. I have two questions, two different questions, two-part questions, actually. So the first one is, there are many versions out there regarding One Health. Your definition is one of the better ones I've seen. Can you reiterate the source for me? And is the 14 participants within the committee the group that defined it?
So we created the mission and vision statements from our group, and all the participants were just people that either I reached out to or other people reached out to that said, hey, this is going on. We think you ought to be a participant in it. And it probably took us about 4 months, I'd say, to develop our mission and vision statements. But it was completely internal. We did certainly evaluate some other One Health statements, but it was something that we generated on our own.
Okay, and then the other question is, sorry if I missed this or misunderstood, but is your One Health organization a Pennsylvania only association, or are you going national?
So we're currently a Pennsylvania only organization. I do participate also in a regional One Health consortium that is relatively new. We've had 3 or 4 meetings now. We seem to meet on a quarterly basis, and it's an organization of the One Health group from Delaware, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maryland. Pennsylvania, I would have to say, our One Health program is, as far as I'm aware, the only state in the union that has a government-based One Health program that's as advanced as we are. Delaware, I would have to say, is pretty doggone close, but Delaware has the advantage of being so small that they're essentially about the size of one of our counties. We've got 67 counties in Pennsylvania. So they're pretty organized. It's a government-based organization, but One Health has, wherever it starts, it seems to start in a slightly different method. New Jersey, interestingly enough, their One Health group is almost exclusively human health providers. It's being run currently by an OBGYN from Robert Wood Johnson Medical Center. They are probably the youngest group in our organization, as in the sense that they are probably the least well-formed and have the least association with government, but they're still working on it. Maryland, that group comes out of the Department of Health primarily. And then Pennsylvania, we started out as a group from agriculture.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions in the chat. So I don't see any hands raised. So if anybody else has a question, now would be the time to either type it or raise your hand.
And for those that come up with a question later on, my email address is there on the slide. Feel free to reach out to me. If you want to get hooked up with our One Health Task Force, you're more than welcome. There is a One Health group at Penn State. And Olivia is her first name, and I can't think of her last name right now. But she has participated in our group, and I believe she listens in most of the time because we do our conferences over the phone as well. We do try to move our meetings around a little bit. Our last meeting was actually held in Bellefonte, but I, living in southeastern Pennsylvania and doing this basically voluntarily, I tend to have my meetings relatively close, but because Pennsylvania is such a large state, we do want to try and get participants from all over the state, we are trying to move around a little bit.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm going to go through one more time. I don't see any hands raised. Don't see any other questions. So before we close out, just want to remind everybody, our next talk is going to be May 6th. And I have a speaker lined up, and I just want to confirm it one more time with him before